I'm so happy to be here. For me, coming to JNU and also to your neighbor IIT, I haven't been there yet, but I will be visiting them, is like coming back home. I was a student here like centuries ago. I'm so old that it feels like a whole different lifetime. I was I did my graduate studies, a PhD in biotechnology from IIT Delhi. And those days, IIT, or maybe it still is, I don't know, maybe worse. It was such a stiff, like very elitist, and a deeply patriarchal place. That's at least how I experienced it. JNU used to be like a breath of fresh air. We used to come here just to, buy books and have chai and have an occasional cigarette, which you couldn't in IIT. IIT where you had to hide. So I had great affection for my JNU days. And then after that, I spent a year here as well. But so yeah, coming back was, I was looking forward to it because I have good memories of your campus. So since I'm going down the memory lane anyway, I thought what I'll do is, instead of giving you an academic take on what the book is about and the various debates and issues, which I'll come to, I'm not going to ignore those. But what I will do is, I will just tell you a story of why these issues that I raise in the book are important to me, have been important for a very long time, and how they knit with my own personal story, my personal evolution as a human being and as an intellectual, and and then through that journey you will see why this whole bunch of ideas that go under post-colonial theory, why they have sat on my heart. They have troubled me. They have troubled me for a long time, and why I had to write a kind of critique that I have. Okay, but at the same time, I must assure you, just because this topic is sort of knitted into my life, doesn't mean that I have been entirely subjective. I have done my best to support whatever problems I have, the critique I have of the major theorists of post-colonialism with arguments, with textual analysis. So it's not just that I'm just, because I have had long-standing problem with post-colonial. I'm not just unloading. I'm not just condemning them because I don't like them. That's not what I'm doing. I have done, you'll see the book is argued and arguments are supported with textual evidence and a historical analysis. So I'm going down the memory lane. Okay. Now, education in modern science, especially biological sciences, was absolutely formative for me. I grew up in a middle class, lower middle class, margins of middle and lower class Punjabi family, with its a reasonably traditional religious family, bhakti tradition sort of. So we would, we had the standard Ram Krishna Bhakti, temple going, and we had the standard prejudices of caste and pride of caste. We took pride in what we were and we looked down upon everybody else. So there was all that. I mean, I was immersed in it like a fish is in water. That was my world. And then I did a master's in microbiology and molecular biology. At that time, the DNA structure was, just barely 10 years old, So biology just opened my mind. It turned me into a secular humanist of the deepest conviction. And I remember it so clearly, that turning around. It wasn't like slowly it was a paradigm shift in my head. I was. And I just couldn't believe in the world of karma and rebirth or anything, supernatural just went out of the window. I don't think I have stepped in a temple since. And I'm what they call in America, good without God. I am good without God, and I make no bones about it. All right, so my turning around was very self-conscious, but it enabled me. It gave me the courage to find my own way. I don't think my family was not happy about it, but I went off on my own. And I came to IIT Delhi as a graduate student to do a PhD. That was in I got my PhD in 1983. I'm so ancient. So let me tell you what the intellectual atmosphere was in Delhi, in a premier institute of science at that time. So this is how personal and political sort of combine for me. There are three kind of forces I experienced. One was a very elitist culture of IIT Delhi. And extreme authoritarianism, patriarchy, and a Bengali ethno-nationalism in the lab. It wasn't a pleasant experience at all. And more than that, more than the personality issues, the quality of science was lamentable. The methodology was not, nobody self-consciously applied a proper methodology. The controls were not improper. You could really come up with any result you wanted as long as, so there was, hello? Please yeah. So this was my laboratory culture. The second was science literacy movements. I had been pretty active in, we had a group at that time called Society of Young Scientists. We were, the usual popular science movement, science literacy. We were deeply connected to Kishore Bharati, which was, again, popular science movements. The idea was to, spread the scientific knowledge around. The third movement started around the fag end of my PhD days, and that was a new breed of social activists who gathered under the leadership of Ashish Nandy and Rajni Kothari at CSTS. Okay, now they condemned modern science. For us, science was a door opener to humanism, and to them, science was the enemy of humanism. It was colonizing the minds. It was turning us into automatons, and science was at the service of the state, an elitist state. So just about everything was, so what they had done was that they had turned their critical gaze not at our inherited traditions, but at scientific reason and secularization itself. All that was attractive to me about science is thrown out of the window. So at that time, I remember Nandi himself will not even, he's too, godlike to know people like me, but we used to go all the way from IIT all the way to CSDS to question them, to fight with them that ye kya keh rahe hain aap, The problem was they had history and some exposure of philosophy. They could cite you the critical theorists of Frankfurt School. We couldn't. We were just plain old lab scientists. So, the point I'm trying to make is that so I was conflicted in all these three. None of them satisfactory. So it is around that time. Reading was something I did, I had to. So that is around the time when I encountered Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. The part where he pleads with Indian intellectuals to subject the time-honored dogmas of the Vedas and the Dharma Shastras to the test of reason and morality, that struck a chord with me. Okay? Because that's how I had experienced, my break with my traditions. So he was asking Indian intellectuals that, hey, every political revolution, he said, is preceded by a social and cultural revolution. You know, as his words were that emancipation of mind is needed for the emancipation, political emancipation. So that was the closest, you know, that anybody, I had not read anybody who kind of was saying something that I felt in my bones. I mean, I did not need a great expertise in history, but I just felt it. So he becomes a comrade and a guru at the same time. And he helped me understand, I mean, why I was upset about the three forces that I was encountering. First, I realized that popular science movements were necessary but insufficient. I felt that just teaching people, you know, what the Newton's laws of physics were, why you should not be scared of eclipses, is not good enough. The fight had to be taken to the metaphysics, to theology. That is what the Enlightenment project in Europe had been. And again, like Ambedkar says, the Enlightenment set the stage for democracy. And Enlightenment was a 18th century movement of middle class. Again, Marxists will say bourgeois hai, isko kuch nahi karo. But yeah, they were middle class intellectuals. Some of them were born nobles, and they're mostly French, but Britain had had its Enlightenment earlier. They relentlessly challenged the claims of theology to be the queen of all sciences. With theology came a challenge to the power of the church, right? So that opened up the power of the authority of the ancient regimes. Power was loosened over the popular mind by these intellectual interventions. And nothing like that had happened in India. We got our freedom without undergoing any such cultural revolution, any such paradigm change. We had our Hindu Renaissance, we had our Vivekananda, we had our Aurobindos, but they were revivalists. They were not asking questions. So I understood that popular science movements cannot be a substitute for what was needed. They were good enough, but you know, they needed to go, and there was no such force that was willing to do it in India. Marxists were busy doing their stuff, and you know, there was nobody. So that was one thing I learned. The second thing I learned from reading of Ambedkar, amongst other things, I don't think Ambedkar, I can say, is a... I also kind of figured out that why I was so upset with Nandi and Co. Even at that time, why I was upset, because they were offering a total critique of modernity that simply collapsed science with instrumental reason, and which they say served the interests of the westernized elites. They were not only denying the critical and emancipatory potential of modern science, the kind of potential I had experienced, and Ambedkar was talking about, they were just denying it. And they were actively, not just denying it, they were actively discrediting it as an agent of colonialism. So, I mean, plenty got clarified, but anyway, to cut the long story short, I did my PhD, I dropped out. After that, I became a science correspondent with Indian Express. I was very committed to popularizing science. I did all that. Then I got interested. Anyway, I went to the US to study history and philosophy of science. And I had one glorious year in University of Indiana, Bloomington campus. A very, very, really top of the class Department of History and Philosophy of Science. But I did not complete any degrees there. Life intervened, various things, I got married and set up a family. In any case, I end up doing PhD in science and technology studies and in RPI, upstate New York. There I realized, I did not know, when I went in I realized that this was a den of postmodernism. It was relativism. It was like Nandi writ 1,000 times. So I was like from the
Out of the fan.
so, but again, I at that time, one thing I must tell you, in my coursework for a PhD, we used to, the whole class used to read Nandi, Vandana Shiva, and the rest, the Shiv Vishwanath, as the voice of the oppressed. This was considered the voice, the voice of third world. This was third world science. Ethno-knowledges were what. So I would get tagged as a colonized mind. I mean, seriously. It was a strange experience to talk of, and because by this time, social constructivism of science had become like the talk of the town. I won't go into the details of it. And at that time, Alan Sokal, some of you might have heard of him. He challenged, he made a hoax. And so I worked with Sokal, and then I wrote a book condemning my own department for its foolishness. So no wonder I did not get a job. I was like, so I had 2 PhDs, a major book, but nobody would hire me. So anyway, in the end, I taught history of science in IISER Mohali and in IISER Pune later on. Now, so all this was going on. So I wrote a book, Profits Facing Backwards, which was a critique of social constructivism. In the meantime, I noticed that something called post-colonial theory has become very important. Because what had happened was, in due time, as Indian intellectuals had found a niche in American universities, and so the homegrown neo-Gandhian critiques of modernity, Nandi's critiques of modernity, had turned postmodern, or as Americans call it, they had gone woke. They became woke. Following in the footsteps of Edward Said's Orientalism, which was deeply influenced by Foucault's cynicism regarding truth and even reality, Indian intellectuals came to see any claims of objective representation of reality as a sham and a mask for the civilizing mission of colonialism. Following Gayatri Spivak's injection of Derrida's deconstruction into subaltern studies, left intellectuals bought into the formula that language constructs discourse, discourse constructs power, and power constructs reality. Reality is also not given. It's malleable enough, shaped by discourses. So henceforth, unmasking how colonial discourses constructed or invented everything from caste to communalism, and even Hinduism itself became the major preoccupation of post-colonial studies. The scientific rationalism of the European Enlightenment, my tradition, Enlightenment, the scientific rationalism of Enlightenment came to be seen as an agent of colonialism and not as an exemplar of radical critique of religion that we could emulate in India. It became like something to condemn. This was accompanied by calls for creating an alternative modernity that would be authentically our own, as Partha Chatterjee calls it, so that we would no longer just sit and wait in the waiting room of history, as Dipesh Chakrabarty calls it, hoping for a secular modernity to dawn. In other words, our modes of thought were to be the foundation of a hybrid alternative modernity, while their model of secular modernity was to be provincialized, was to be set aside. By now, I was better grounded in the history of science and the Enlightenment. I realized that post-colonial intellectuals have fallen in a trap. They were subjectively on the left, in the sense that they were committed to solidarity with those on the margins, the poor and the humiliated. But this progressive political subjectivity was enveloped in a penumbra of anti-universalist, anti-realist and anti-rational values that have traditionally belonged to the anti-Enlightenment right. So the core was leftist. The case that they were making belonged to the right. This led me to a serious study of the anti-Enlightenment tradition that began in earnest with German Romanticism in the 18th century. Let's not forget, and critique of Enlightenment is Nandi and all are not saying something great. I mean, the critique of enlightenment as old as the Enlightenment. The moment rationalism became a political force, it was attacked viciously, terribly from conservative critics on all sides. In Britain, in France, in Germany, it took roots because German culture had certain peculiarities. So this made me, I went back to study the counter-revolution. What is it? Where is it coming from? So then serious study of, especially German Romanticism, okay, became the center of my focus. Now, why German Romanticism? It has a long-standing connection with India. It started out, German Romanticism was a movement by German poets and philosophers who were in the late 18th century, late 17th century, 18th century, and continuing down to 20th. What happened was Germany was late to modernize, late to become a nation state. It was just so many different provincialities. Late to become a nation state, late to industrialize, and late to democratize. The enlightened. So when through Napoleon, after Napoleon's attacks on Germany, there was a very strong resentment and anger against France and against French ideas. One can see how, like, we are reacting constantly to colonialism, they were reacting constantly and negatively to the French. So the movement arose to question, to challenge the French Enlightenment and French Revolution. The important scholars were, Johann Herder, Novalis, Schlegel brothers, or Friedrich and August Schlegel, and then later the whole tradition was taken over by Nietzsche, and then later inherited by people I call conservative revolutionaries. I'll come to that in a minute. Why were they attracted to India? What happened was, at that time, William Jones and all were translating our Sanskrit texts into English. Especially the Shakuntala, the Bhagavad Gita, Gita Govinda, Meghaduta, and Laws of Manu. William Jones had done it so that they could understand Indian law better. But these books in English were being read everywhere in the world. So Germans find them very attractive. Why? Why? Because Germans, intellectuals, were upset with the with the transformation of their society, which was happening rapidly because they were slow. It was beginning to rapid industrialization, marketization. The whole society is getting, peasant society is getting dispersed. So they were looking for an antidote to modernity, the industrial and capitalist modernity. To them, ancient India provided the model, because here, the caste communities provided a sense of community. Nature was not separate from God, unlike in Christianity. There was unity, there was organic unity, and there was poetry. And so each and every one of the romantic philosophers is a great Indophile. Schlegel and Nietzsche turned to Law of Manu as their favorite text, because they wanted to resurrect aristocratic elite, which was not possible in the Christian. The old feudal aristocracy had been destroyed. So this was their inspiration. They thought Laws of Manu are the answer. So what happens is, coming to what I call the conservative revolutionaries, in the Weimar Republic, in between the wars, Weimar Republic is 1919, after Germany loses the First World War. This is the first time the emperor has abdicated, Germany is defeated, a new constitution is signed, which for the first time in Germany, like for us in 1947, the first time they were also adopting a secular social democratic, which gave universal suffrage and turned it into a constitution republic. Now, what happened is this progressive movement started off a huge reaction from the nationalists, from German nationalists, who thought that this was an imposition. Now look at they rejected Weimar. They were effective in bringing down the republic and paving the way for Nazis to come over, to take over. They were not alone. Marxists also were. To them, it was bourgeois democracy. To the conservatives, it was a foreign model. That was their complaint. Just like post-colonialism contests the Enlightenment for its colonial origins, to the German conservatives, it was a French imposition. French and Anglo imposition. The idea of liberal modernity, of individual rights. Individual rights were hated because they were a sign of breakdown of the community. So I want to generalize. I want to just spend a minute on what are conservative revolutions. So what happened is from 1919 to the time when our man Hitler walks into the Reichstag, there are these well-known, world-renowned philosophers to give you some names of how important these people were. We had Oswald Spengler, who wrote a book, Decline of the West, which ran into some 20 editions. I mean, it was a global bestseller. Oswald Spengler, Moller van den Broek, who coined the name Third Reich, Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist, Edgar Jung, Hans Freyer, Carl Schmitt, Martin Heidegger. These were the top names of German philosophers and intellectuals. They were the biggest warriors against the democratic constitution because allegedly it was imposing a foreign way of thinking. Liberalism was not compatible with the folk traditions. They wanted exactly what post-colonial theories want, an alternative modernity which will be grounded in the local values, traditional values. Okay, now that's it. So we'll come to that. So that is precisely what they wanted. They wanted the technologies. They were, again, when it comes to scientific reason, Spengler's ideas were so influential that even Adolf Hitler adopted the idea that even different societies have different sciences. He says Nordic people have Nordic sciences, Jewish people have Jewish sciences, and Nordic sciences are better than Jews because Nordic science, Newton science. Newton could see the complex organic connections, while Jews, being so practical minded, they're only worried about profit and loss. They only argue in numbers. And Einstein's physics is Jewish physics because he can't get over his Jewishness. So these are the fruits of the conservative revolution, looking for a Germanic modernity. Okay, now what happened is the conservative revolution had inherited these romantic Germans and anti-liberal. These are pre-fascist ideas. These are ideas that Nazis will run with later, but they injected these ideas into the popular culture in the interwar years. Now, I am suggesting that there were direct and indirect influences of conservative revolutionaries on Indian anti-colonial intellectuals. Vivekananda and Gandhi. Read even Hind Swaraj, which is such a rejectionist book. I mean, it trashes the West. But back of it, who are the references? Who are the people he's quoting? Schlegel and Max Muller. Similarly with Vivekananda, he worships Max Muller and follows to the dot his Aryan conception of Indian history. Read Bipin Chandra Pal and Aurobindo. Their conception of Indian political institutions is exactly, and their idea of reawakening of Indian soul follows exactly parallel to the arguments of the conservative revolutionaries. And there were some obvious Nazi connections. We only, in India, we only look at RSS and Nazis, RSS and Mussolini. Sorry, the influence of Nazism, Nazi ideas, pre-Nazi ideologies, the whole worldview of conservative nationalists was absolutely self-evident on the mainstream of Indian nationalism. We have to, for example, Taraknath Das, Binoy Kumar Sarkar, they were the conduits of Nazi ideas into Indian social sciences, and they had deep connections with the what's his name, Ramakrishna Mission. So they thought of RK Mission and certain Gaudiya Vaishnava sects. They looked at them as conduits of Nazism, and they are not. Gaudiyas and RK Mission people are not considered Nazis, or not considered Hindu nationalists or RSS, but they shared a worldview. Okay, all right. So what I'll continue. I don't have too much time. I have argued that what happened in the Weimar Republic is a good vantage point to understand the nature of Indian nationalism and post-colonial theory. Okay, there is a overlap. Why do I say post-colonial theory shares the spirit of conservative revolution, which was present in Indian nationalism? Indian nationalism. No, I deny that that Indian nationalism was secular and RSS was Hindu nationalist. I deny that. There was plenty of Hindu traditionalism, Hindu chauvinism, Hindu superiority in the mainstream of Indian nationalism. It will be foolish to close your eyes to the cultural nationalist elements of the mainstream nationalism of Gandhi, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, and the rest of them. Tilak, for example, or Dayanand. They were not RSS. They were part and part. There were so many Arya Samajis working with Gandhi and vice versa. So, Congress was full of Hindu traditionalists. So I'm saying that this shared worldview is present. Shared worldview of conservative nationalism is present in mainstream of Indian nationalism, of course in Hindu nationalism, and amongst the post-colonial. What is the features of the shared worldview? Shared the same objectives as the Weimar's conservative revolutionaries, and here are the civilizational relativism, a Spenglerian logic that different civilizations think differently, and that norms of reason are incommensurate. They all reject the merely sensory knowledge of the materialist West as a foreign or a colonial imposition which is a source of epistemic violence. They all share the view that we must create an alternative modernity that expresses the spirit of the folk or the subaltern. And they essentialize the folk as essentially spiritual and non-secular. Anybody, read Provincializing Europe. Dipesh Chakrabarty makes the subaltern to be like it is in their nature to be God believers, to think that they will secularize means that you are putting us in the waiting room of history. If this is not essentialization, that the gods are integral, and without the gods, the subaltern will stop being human beings. I mean, it's so that's what I mean. They essentialize the folk as spiritual or non-secular, and like Nandi does, as essentially tolerant, essentially innocent. It complete devoid of. I go into that. I mean, his view of the innocence of our traditions is so devoid of empirical evidence or historical backing at all. I mean, so there is that sort of a thing is what connects the worldview with the conservative revolutionaries. Now, once you see the whole history of Indian nationalism from what I'm suggesting, see it as a conservative revolution, three fallacies of post-colonial theory become absolutely obvious. First is the fallacy of the derivative discourse. As well known, Partha Chatterjee keeps on arguing that Indian nationalism is a derivative discourse of colonialism that, to quote him, accepted the bourgeois rationalist conception of knowledge established in post-Enlightenment period of European intellectual history as a universal frame of thought. Our whole nationalism is defective because it accepted the Enlightenment. That to me is one of the most, I mean, I can't make sense of that statement because he uses that he means this very seriously. This is not a metaphor. That's why, what's his name? Bankim Chandra, the guy who gave us Vande Mataram and the most poisonous of all anti-Muslim books, he's criticized not for his communalism, but because he was a positivist. Was he a positivist? Okay, he was a positivist. And then he also argues that the Indian nationalism took the culture as its domain, and that's where it won its freedom. But what Enlightenment reason was being used in the spiritual domain? I mean, that was the reasoning of these Vivekananda, Aurobindo, who absorbed scientific reason into Hindu mysticism, was contrary to the Enlightenment. They were, let me, 1 minute, I get excited when I talk about it. So I have argued that if Indian nationalism is a derivative discourse of anything, it is a derivative of European counter-enlightenment. When Indian intellectuals began to define a national identity in the 19th century, they fell back on the same stock of ideas that had attracted German reactionaries to India in the first place, namely a sense of organic unity between spirit and matter, between individuals and community. The same organicist understanding of the nation and society, the same hostility to parliamentary democracy, at least in the case of Gandhi, and the same recoil against materialism of modern civilization that marked the German folkish nationalism are abundantly evident in the writings of our icons from Vivekananda to Aurobindo to Gandhi. Far from being hypnotized by the Enlightenment ideals of reason, liberal freedoms and progressive secularization, as critics like Nandi and Chakravarti and Chatterjee have claimed, the mainstream of anti-colonial nationalism hollowed out these ideals and reinterpreted them in a dharmic. You'll need to give me 5 extra minutes. I won't be able to complete. So just 10 minutes more. Then I'll leave that. So I'm saying, far from being hypnotized by the Enlightenment ideals of reason, liberal freedoms and progressive secularization, as critics like Nandi and Chatterjee have claimed, the mainstream of anti-colonial movement hollowed out these ideals and reinterpreted them in a dharmic framework that sets India's organic wholeness and spiritualism against individualism and philosophical materialism that were fundamental to modernity. The dharmic spin on modern ideas was carried out with endorsements from German and British romantic critics of modernity who had reached out to ancient India for inspiration. Ideas that were borrowed by romantics from India were now returning home with a seal of approval of European anti-modernists. Like I said, Vivekananda he's so worshipful. He calls Max Miller the Vedantist of Vedantists. The idea of practical Vedanta, that God is in everybody, that was given to him by Paul Deussen, again a German Orientalist. So the borrowings are so complete. Then second fallacy of postcolonial theory is blindness to romanticism. Architects of postcolonial theory are simply blind to the influence of the long European anti-Enlightenment tradition on colonial society. Edward Said, for example, kept German Orientalists strictly out of the purview of Orientalism. His idea of Orientalism clearly excludes Germans because they did not have colonial possessions. Okay. Nandi Chatterjee and Dipesh Chakrabarti and their numerous acolytes equate the colonial legacy solely with the Enlightenment rationalism, which they consider oppressive, culturally alien, etc. Colonialism is equated with Enlightenment, completely closing their eyes to the presence of counter-Enlightenment and while ignoring completely that the Romanticist episteme was also a part of the colonial experience. Indeed, post-colonialists appear to share this orientation of romantics, as is evident from their defense, even celebration, of the non-modern values and religiosity of the subaltern as resistance to the West. Post-colonialism, I have argued, is simply a return of the romanticist revolt against the modern age, a revolt as old as the modern age itself. The third fallacy is the fallacy of subaltern autonomy. I am aware that when the left, post-colonial left, talks of decolonization and epistemic justice, they do not mean to bring back Brahminical traditions as Modi and RSS are doing. On the contrary, they are against any kind of monoculture, and the idea of decolonization is to let 1,000 flowers bloom so that the knowledge traditions of the marginalized people like Adivasis, Dalits and women can get a fair hearing after centuries of colonial dominance. The problem is that contrary to the subaltern studies, the little traditions of the subaltern are not autonomous of the great traditions of the Brahmins. The Puranic way of being that scholars like Aditya Nigam and Dipesh Chakrabarti propose as an alternative to colonial modernity is steeped in a Brahminical worldview where gods can manifest themselves anywhere, anytime, just like God Ram appeared in Babri Masjid. Remember how the masjid was taken? Remember that? एक झूठ बोल के मूर्ति रखी थी और उसके बाद ये लोग बाहर भजन, करोड़ों लोग भजन गा रहे हैं कि राम प्रकट हो गए. वो पुरानिक वर्ल्ड व्यू से ही आया है. ये कोई सबाल्टर्न, they look at subaltern worldview as some sort of a source of great breakthrough and a progressive thought. I'm sorry, where is the evidence for that? Where did they get the idea? Push comes to shove, the subalterns will stand with the saffron brigade. When the अच्छा, so मेरा मतलब ये है कि ये जो idea इनका कि the subaltern are they have an autonomous worldview, and they are only a source of resistance is just not. That's not how religion works. In fact, they're shaped by the great tradition as well. Even if there might be bhakti elements that are opposed to the great tradition, the subaltern are shaped by the great tradition. To just discount it all and call it call it autonomous consciousness is lacks. So finally, I'll come to that last one thesis, which I know is getting a lot of coverage, and that the post-colonial left is a bedfellow, strange bedfellows with the Hindu right. Now, the two things I will say to preface what that's my claim. My claim is that कोई difference नहीं रहा इन दोनों का. The first thing, two things I'll say in as a preface to my thesis. One is there is an enormous condescension and conceit amongst the leftists who just look down on the right wing writers as ये तो intellectual नहीं है, ये तो ideologues हैं, हम intellectual हैं. If you and therefore they have ignored the right wing ideas, which are their books are selling as #1 bestsellers in this country. People read more of the right wing historians than they do of JNU historians, or me or anybody else here. Now, so they won't read it. Secondly, what they don't realize, had they read them properly, here is what I discovered when I read them. I hate that stuff, but I spent really months poring through the works of 4 major right-wing authors, Colonel Delst, Rajiv Malhotra, S.N. What's his name? Bal Gangadhara, and our man, Sai Deepak. And it was painful reading, but I read it. One thing becomes crystal clear from early works of Elst to the later works of Rajiv Malhotra. The new right has moved away from Sarva Dharma Samabhav. They have zero respect for the idea. They consider this to be Gandhi's and Nehru's mistake. Why? Because they want to openly assert the superiority of Hinduism over all other. Baki sab mat hai, mat. They're just sects, while we are the universal religion. And they want to, this whole ties up with the Vishwaguru business. And my point is that right now post-colonial theory is serving a very essential function in the Hindu right discourse, because they have to dismantle Eurocentrism. They have to get rid of the idea that European ideas are universal. Otherwise, how can they proclaim the superiority of the universal application of Hindu Dharma? So you see, to them it is, पहले Savarkar and all used to be कि Islam की problem है कि वो बाहर से आया, right? अब इनकी the new right thinks Islam की problem है Quran. So they have to demolish the Quran and assert the superiority of Vedas. तो उसके लिए provincializing Europe becomes essential for them, and that is why. So I'll just give you a taste of how Hindu right deploys the spirit and the letter of post-colonial theory. First, look at the shared spirit. All 4 of these authors see themselves as carrying out the post-colonial agenda of reversing the gaze. Remember the beautiful words of post-colonial, reverse the gaze. That is subjecting colonial knowledge to a critique from the native's perspective. Then provincializing Europe. Provincializing Europe, I describe in my book one event, RSS, big RSS presence. Rakesh Sinha invokes Dipesh Chakrabarti as a true nationalist because he's put Europe in its box. And they say कि जैसे भगवान राम ने रावण से सीखा था, हम भी ये मार्क्सिस्ट से ये सीख सकते हैं कि यूरोप को कैसे provincialize करना है. So there is that. And then the arguments. Forget about these pet phrases. The arguments. All 4 locate themselves in the scholarly tradition of post-colonial and decolonial theory. Edward Said, Ashish Nandi and Dipesh Chakrabarti are as much the heroes of the right as they are of the left. Only Sai Deepak prefers Latin American decolonial thinkers, but he joins decolonial theory with Bal Gangadhara's idiosyncratic reading of Edward Said. All 4 subscribe wholeheartedly to the view that existing model of modernity is colonial, and modern India remains captive of colonial consciousness. That is the S.N. Bal Gangadhara and Sai Deepak's biggest gripe. कि ये foreign OET है, right? So moreover, as with the post-colonial left, they give colonial discourses the sole agency to construct what we take to be real. Bal Gangadhar, who is the most Saidian of all, argues that there is no such thing as a caste system or a religion called Hinduism. Nothing like this existed in India until the British invented them. Anyone familiar with the post-colonial theorists like Gyan Prakash, Gyan Pandey, Nick Dirks, and Ashish Nandia on how colonialists invented the idea of caste, communalism, and even a Semiticized masculine Hinduism cannot miss the similarities. Labeling the colonial conceptual categories as Christian or Abrahamic is another shared feature. Kannad Els, Rajiv Malhotra, Sai Deepak argue that secularism is a Christian idea and therefore a truly Bharatiya constitution will do away with it. Secularism as a gift of Christianity, you will recall, was first put on the agenda by none other than Nandi and Madan, who very much belonged to the anti-Hindutva left. All four see the West as having falsely universalized, all four by right-wing intellectuals, all four see the West as having falsely universalized its peculiar conception of rationality and science as obligatory for the whole world. Rajiv Malhotra decries, in the same vein as Nandi, modern natural sciences as Judeo-Christian ways of knowing that is inferior to the inner sciences of dharmic religions. The other three leave natural sciences alone but are unified in attacking the mainstream of social sciences as infected with Orientalism and Christian metaphysics. Bal Gangadhar literally labels social sciences as bakwas. I mean, it's a technical word, bakwas, okay, because of Orientalism. Such are the conceptual overlaps between the two sides. It's in light of these substantive agreements between the two, the right and left, that I call them strange bedfellows. I'm accused, I know the critics are telling me ki, to kya hua, if ideas can be used by anybody, these are superficial similarities, they're just borrowing some. That is not the case. The overlap runs much deeper. All right, I'll end here.